The sun had barely risen when Michael left his small apartment on the north side of New York City. The streets were still deserted, except for a few early risers and street vendors beginning to set up their stands. It was yet another day of searching for work, another attempt to prove to himself that his past was behind him. Michael straightened his worn-out shirt and ran his hand through the gray hair at his temples as he caught his reflection in a shop window. At 45, his face bore the marks of a life he wished to forget. It had been 5 years since he had decided to change, since he had promised himself he would never again be the man he used to be. While walking down Carter Street, he felt something different. A stray dog with matted yellowish fur began to follow him. At first, Michael tried to ignore it, but there was something in the animal's gaze, an almost human urgency in its brown eyes, that piqued his curiosity. "Go, get out of here," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. Yet the dog persisted, alternating between low barks and an anxious whine. That was when Michael noticed the red collar, worn and faded with time. Something didn't add up. Street dogs don't usually wear collars. After a few blocks, and overcome by the animal's insistence, Michael knelt down. The dog immediately approached, allowing him to examine the collar. His fingers soon brushed against a folded piece of paper tied with a string. With slightly trembling hands, Michael unfolded the paper. The childish, irregular, and hurried handwriting tightened his heart as he read, "Help. My brother is sick. Apt 3B. Michael felt the weight of those words like a punch in the gut. His mind immediately began to consider the possibilities. It could be a trap, something designed to lure in unsuspecting people. In his past, he had seen similar schemes and even taken part in plans that exploited the goodwill of others. But there was something different this time. The trembling handwriting, the crumpled paper, the urgency in the dog's eyes. Everything seemed too genuine to be a hoax. "What kind of story is this, buddy?" he murmured to the dog, which responded with a low bark and trotted a few meters ahead, then pausing now and again to make sure Michael was following. The decision had to be made right then and there. Following the dog meant getting involved in something that could further complicate his already difficult life. Michael knew all too well the weight of wrong choices, carrying their consequences every day in the wary looks he received and in the doors that closed whenever his past was mentioned. By the time the sun was higher in the sky, Michael made his choice. "All right, let's go," he said, following the animal as it guided him through the narrow back alleys of the neighborhood. With every step, he felt an inner conflict grow. The part of him that had learned to survive warned of danger, yet another, deeper voice urged him on. The dog led him for about 15 minutes, winding its way through alleys and lanes that grew ever narrower. Gradually, the scenery changed. Well-kept storefronts gave way to peeling buildings, and pristine sidewalks were replaced by uneven pavement scattered with accumulated trash. Finally, they stopped in front of a 4-story building. The facade, once a bright yellow, was now stained by moisture and the relentless passage of time. An old rusted iron staircase wound its way along the side of the building, and the entrance hall, devoid of a door, offered only a dark opening that reeked of mold and neglect. Michael hesitated once more. Years on the streets had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this place didn't feel right. The silence was heavy and oppressive. Even the usual city sounds seemed muffled here. The dog ascended the first few steps of the interior staircase and looked back, as if saying, "Hurry up." Michael took a deep breath, ran his fingers over the amulet that hung around his neck, a nervous habit from years past, and began to climb. Each step creaked beneath his feet, echoing through the stairwell. On the 3rd floor, the dog stopped in front of a door marked 3B, in numbers that were partially faded. The door was ajar, a narrow gap letting through a beam of yellow light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Let us know which city you're watching from, and we'll keep going. Michael slowly pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. The creak of the hinges shattered the silence like a scream. The first thing he noticed was the smell, a mix of mold and something else he couldn't quite identify. The light, filtering in through the dirty windows, revealed an apartment that was nearly empty. In the center of the room, a thin boy who looked no older than 8 sat on the floor. In his arms, he held a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. The older boy raised his eyes, half closed, and scrutinized every move Michael made. There was no fear in his gaze, only a measured caution that belied his age. "Hi," Michael said softly. "I found your note." The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes darted to the dog, which had trotted in wagging its tail, and then lay down beside him like a faithful guardian. "Are you a cop?" the boy asked in a low, almost whispered voice. "No," Michael replied, remaining where he was. "My name is Michael. Your dog brought me here." "Popcorn," the boy said, running his hand through the animal's fur. "He's smart. He knew he'd find someone." The baby stirred in the boy's arms, letting out a soft whimper. Michael noticed that the child's face was flushed and his breathing slightly labored. "What's your name?" Michael asked, taking a cautious step further into the apartment. "Caleb," the boy replied flatly. "And this is Theo." Michael looked around. The apartment contained only a few scattered items: a worn school backpack in one corner, some folded clothes atop a cardboard box, and a thin mattress leaning against the wall. There was no visible food or water. The windows were closed, and Michael's skin prickled when he noticed that the front door was secured with several deadbolts from the inside. "Where are your parents, Caleb?" Caleb adjusted his brother in his arms before answering with precise, almost rehearsed movements, as if he had done this 100 times. "They went to take care of some things, but Theo is sick. He needs medicine." Michael moved closer, crouching down to be at Caleb's eye level. Up close, he could see the baby's condition more clearly. Theo didn't seem to be more than a year old, and his little face was far too warm. "How long ago did they leave?" Caleb averted his gaze, his fingers tightening slightly around the blanket wrapped around his brother. "I'm not really sure. The days all blend together here." The evasive answer set off several alarms in Michael's mind. His years on the streets had taught him to recognize when someone was hiding something. Caleb spoke like an adult, trying to deflect, weighing every word carefully. "Do you have any food? Water?" "We have a little," Caleb replied, nodding toward the backpack in the corner, "but it's running low." Michael got up and walked to the kitchen. The refrigerator was off and empty, and the cabinets held only a few cookies, along with a half-empty package of instant noodles. On the sink, an empty baby bottle and some washed diapers were drying on a cloth. Returning to the living room, Michael noticed that Caleb was watching him intently, as if expecting something. There was a palpable tension in the air, an untold story hovering between them. "Listen, Caleb," Michael said carefully. "You can't stay here alone. Your brother needs to see a doctor." "You can't call anyone," Caleb replied quickly, fear flashing across his face for the first time. "They said not to let anyone in, not to talk to anyone." "Who? Your parents?" Caleb hugged his older brother tightly, his eyes now fixed on the floor. Popcorn, sensing the boy's tension, moved closer and nuzzled his leg. "You don't understand," Caleb murmured. "It has to be this way for now." Michael felt a knot form in his throat. He recognized that look, the kind of fear he had seen in his own eyes during long nights of running, when every shadow could hide danger. "All right," he finally said, "but I'm going to get you some things, food and medicine for Theo. Do you trust me to do that?" Caleb looked up, studying Michael's face for a long moment. It was a gaze too old for a child, a look that had seen too much. "Popcorn trusted you," he finally replied, "and he never makes mistakes." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of that newfound trust. As he prepared to leave, he noticed something he'd missed before: deep scratch marks around the lock, as if someone had recently tried to force entry. The story of these children was more complex than it appeared, and Michael knew that by deciding to help, he was getting involved in something much larger than he had imagined. But looking at Caleb, at little Theo in his arms, and at Popcorn, lying loyally beside them, he knew there was no turning back. Michael descended the building stairs with his mind in turmoil. The morning sun was high by the time he reached the street, illuminating the building's dirty windows. Stopping on the sidewalk, he looked up at the third floor, where he knew 2 children were waiting, and the decision he now had to make felt like it weighed a ton. His first instinct was to seek out the neighbors, Someone had to know something about these children, about their parents, about what was happening. He began knocking on the ground floor door. An elderly lady opened just a crack, her eyes wary behind the chain. "Good morning, Ma'am. I'm looking for information about the children in Upturn 3B. But the door closed before he could finish his sentence. The same thing happened at the next apartment, and the one after that. On the second floor, a middle-aged man had even started to respond. But his wife quickly pulled him inside, whispering something that sounded like, "Mind your own business." It was as if there were an unspoken pact of silence in the building. Everyone knew something. That much was clear, but they preferred to hide behind closed doors and drawn curtains. The fear was palpable, drifting through the hallways like old dust. At the nearest pharmacy, Michael bought children's fever reducer and some other basic medications. Then at the corner store, he filled a bag with milk, diapers, cookies, and non-perishable food items. His mind quickly calculated that the little money he had saved for emergencies would have to be enough. Back at the apartment, he found Caleb sitting on the old couch, soothing his brother, who now slept more peacefully, the fever subsiding thanks to the medicine. Popcorn lifted his head as Michael entered, wagging his tail slightly. "Someone's been here, hasn't they?" Michael asked, noticing how Popcorn was stationed near the door, ears perked up. "No," Caleb replied, though his voice trembled. "I only heard footsteps in the hallway. They always come by just to check." "And who are they, Caleb?" The boy shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. Michael didn't press further. Instead, he began organizing the supplies he'd brought, preparing a bottle for Theo. "Do you know how to do this?" Caleb asked, watching intently. "I've learned a few things in life," Michael replied as he tested the temperature of the milk on his wrist. "I've cared for children before." It was only half true. Michael had learned the basics during his years on the streets, helping single mothers who also lived there. People who, like him, carried stories they'd rather forget. While Theo eagerly drank his bottle, Michael examined the apartment in more detail. There were signs that someone had left in a hurry, half-open drawers, a picture frame lying face down, marks on the wall where photos had once hung. In the bedroom, he found a double bed without a mattress and a disassembled crib. "Did your parents say when they'd be back?" Caleb adjusted his brother in his arms before answering. "They always say a lot of things." The answer, laden with bitter wisdom, made Michael sit down on the floor beside the boy. Popcorn came over and lay down between them like a living bridge. "You know, Caleb, sometimes you have to trust someone, even when you're told not to." "Trust anyone," Michael said softly. Caleb looked up, studying Michael's face with an intensity that belied his age. "Have you ever had to run away from something?" The question caught Michael by surprise. "Why do you ask?" "By the way you look at the door, by the way you listen for sounds. It's just like Dad." A chill ran down Michael's spine. Caleb's perceptiveness was frightening. "Yes, I've had to run away, but I've learned that running isn't always the best solution." "Sometimes it's the only one," Caleb murmured so softly that Michael almost didn't hear. The ensuing silence was then broken by knocks on the door. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Caleb immediately shrank back, his wide eyes fixed on the entrance. Popcorn stood up, his fur bristling, as a low growl rumbled in his throat. "It's the sign," Caleb whispered. "They're checking." Michael slowly got up and moved toward the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw only an empty hallway, yet there was a feeling, a presence that sent his old instincts screaming an alarm. "We need to get you out of here," he said, turning to Caleb. "This place isn't safe." "We can't leave," Caleb replied, his voice trembling. "They're everywhere. Dad said that only here are we safe." "Safe from what, Caleb?" The boy hugged his older brother tightly, as if to shield him not only from danger but from the truth itself. "From the men who want to make Dad pay his debt." Deciding to seek official help wasn't easy for Michael. He knew the system all too well, how it rarely worked in favor of the vulnerable. But with Theo still feverish and Caleb clearly traumatized, he saw no other alternative. The neighborhood social services center was only a 20-minute walk away. Michael had taken the children to his apartment the previous night after much insistence and the promise that they'd return if something went wrong. Caleb had slept clutching his brother, with popcorn standing guard by the bed. At the center, the social worker, a middle-aged woman named Rachel, listened to his story with an expression that wavered between skepticism and concern. Her eyes kept darting to the computer screen, where Michael knew his past was on display. "So you just found these children?" she asked. "It was the dog that brought me here," Michael explained for the third time. "There was a note asking for help. And where is that note now?" Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The paper had disappeared during the hasty move to his apartment, yet another detail working against him. "Ms. Rachel," he began, leaning forward, "there are 2 children who need help. The younger one is sick and the older one is clearly traumatized. That's what matters right now." Rachel sighed, removing her glasses to clean them methodically. "Mr. Michael, I understand your concern, but I need to be clear. Your situation is complicated. My past has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with it," she replied, sliding her glasses back on. "You have a criminal record. You don't have a steady job. You live off odd jobs. And now you show up with 2 children who, according to you, were abandoned by their parents. Can you understand how that sounds?" Michael felt his blood boil but kept his voice steady. "Do you want to go see them? Look with your own eyes. Talk to the neighbors, who refuse to speak." "I've already dispatched a team to check the address," Rachel said while consulting some notes. "But without the parents or legal guardians, our options are limited." "And in the meantime, do we just leave the children alone?" "The standard procedure would be to place them in a temporary shelter." "No," Michael interrupted louder than he intended. Then, lowering his voice, he continued, "You don't understand. Something's not right here. Those children are scared. They're hiding from someone." Rachel studied him for a moment. "Mr. Michael, if there's any suspicion of danger, we need to alert the appropriate authorities. And how long will that take? Days? Weeks? While the bureaucracy runs its course, 2 children need help right now." A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the murmur of the social services center continued. People talking, phones ringing, printers humming along. The system, with its slow and relentless gears, was in full motion. "I can pay a visit this afternoon," Rachel finally said. "I'll see the children and assess the situation. But let me be clear. If there's any indication of irregularity, I'll have to take the necessary measures." Michael nodded, feeling a weight in his stomach. He knew that the necessary measures meant separating the children, placing them into the system, exactly what Caleb feared most. Back at the apartment, Michael found Caleb sitting on the old couch, soothing his brother, who now slept more peacefully as the fever subsided with the medicine. Popcorn lifted his head at the sound of Michael's return, wagging his tail gently. "They're coming, aren't they?" Caleb asked, his small voice firm. "How do you know?" "They always come. They've come before too." Michael sat down beside him. "Before?" "When they found us," Caleb continued in a monotone voice. "Social workers, child protective services. Dad always said they didn't understand. That sometimes you have to hide to protect yourself." "Protect from what, Caleb?" Caleb was silent for so long that Michael thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was barely a whisper. "From the truth." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Let us know which city you're watching from, and we'll keep going. Rachel's visit changed everything, not because of the report she prepared or the questions she asked, but because of something no one could have foreseen. She recognized Theo. "This baby," she murmured, adjusting her glasses as she examined the boy in Caleb's arms. "I remember him from the city hospital 11 months ago." Michael, who had been leaning against the wall watching the exchange, straightened up immediately. "What do you mean?" Rachel removed her glasses and rubbed her tired eyes. "I was on social work duty that night. It was a peculiar case. The mother arrived alone in labor. She presented documents that we later found out were fake." Caleb clutched his brother to his chest, his eyes never leaving the social worker's face. There was something in her expression, not fear, but a resignation, as if she had known this moment would come. "After the birth," Rachel continued, "there were complications. The mother needed a blood transfusion. That's when we discovered that she wasn't our real mother," Caleb finished, his voice surprisingly calm. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael felt as if the air had been sucked right out of the room. Sensing the tension, Popcorn moved closer to Caleb and nuzzled his leg. "Caleb," Rachel said softly, "do you know anything else?" Caleb slowly nodded. "They aren't our parents. They never were. But they said it was for our own good, that they were protecting us." Michael sat down beside Caleb, his heart pounding. "Protecting us from what?" "From the truth," Caleb replied, the words coming out as if rehearsed 1,000 times. "About who we really are. About our true family." Rachel was already on the phone, her fingers rapidly tapping on her tablet. "We need to check the records of missing children from the last—" "No need," Caleb interrupted. "I know who we are. I've always known." From the pocket of his pants, the boy pulled out a piece of paper, folded so many times that its creases were nearly worn away. It was a clipping from an old newspaper, yellowed with time. Michael took the paper with trembling hands. The faded headline read, "Heirs of the Pharmaceutical Empire Disappear After Nanny Incident." "You are—" Michael began but couldn't finish. "The grandchildren of the owner of Pharmacorp," Caleb confirmed. "Our real parents were in a car accident when I was 4. It was when Marina, our nanny, took us in." The pieces were finally beginning to fall into place. Pharmacorp was one of the largest pharmacy chains in the country, an empire built over 3 generations. The disappearance of the founder's grandchildren had once made national headlines. "But why?" Rachel asked, barely concealing her shock. "Marina thought our grandfather was evil," Caleb explained, his words carrying a weight far beyond his years. "That he only cared about money. She said she was going to protect us from him, give us a normal life." "And what about the ones who claimed to be your parents?" Michael asked. "Friends of hers, they moved us from city to city whenever someone got suspicious. But this time—" Caleb hesitated, glancing at Theo. "This time was different. Marina fell very ill. The others panicked and started arguing about what to do with us." Rachel was already making more calls, her professional tone barely masking the urgency. Michael, however, barely heard her. His attention was entirely focused on Caleb, who, for the first time since Michael had known him, truly seemed like a child, scared, exhausted from carrying a secret too big to bear alone. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Michael asked softly. "Because they said our grandfather was dangerous, that he'd never forgive us for running away, that he would send us to different places." Caleb sniffed, a lone tear escaping down his cheek. "I couldn't let them separate us. I promised our parents I'd always take care of Theo." Michael felt a lump in his throat. All these years, that boy had carried not only the burden of protecting his little brother, but also the weight of a truth no one should have to bear alone. The sound of distant sirens made Popcorn perk up his ears. Rachel had alerted the authorities. In a matter of minutes, the room would be swarming with police officers, social workers, and reporters. The story of Pharmacorp's lost heirs was finally coming to an end. But for Michael, something still didn't add up. Turning to Caleb, he asked, "Why did you decide to trust me?" Caleb smiled for the first time, a sad, wise smile beyond his years. "Because you have the same eyes as me, eyes of someone who knows what it's like to need a second chance." The following weeks passed like a whirlwind. The media exploded with news of the reunion of Pharmacorp's lost heirs. The long-circulating theories were debunked or confirmed. Marina was found in a public hospital, battling a terminal illness. And the fake parents turned themselves in to the authorities, confirming every part of Caleb's story. But for Michael, the real drama was unfolding far from the cameras, in the silent corridors of the hospital where Charles Edward Mitchell, the patriarch of Pharmacorp, met his grandchildren for the first time in 4 years. Michael watched from afar, his heart heavy, as the grey-haired man knelt before Caleb. There were no words at first, only tears, the tears of a grandfather who had lost everything and now, inexplicably, had a second chance. "You are exactly like your mother," Charles Edward Mitchell finally said, his voice choked with emotion. She had that same strength in her eyes. Caleb, still clutching Theo, studied his grandfather with an analytical gaze that Michael knew all too well. Aren't you angry with us? The old businessman let out a sad laugh. Angry? My boy, I spent 4 years searching every corner of this country for you. I hired detectives, offered rewards. All I ever wanted was to have my family back. But Marina said— Marina was confused, Charles Edward Mitchell gently interrupted. She thought she was protecting you, but she didn't realize she was only creating more pain. At that moment, Theo, who had been dozing, opened his eyes and without hesitation stretched out his little arms toward his grandfather, as if something in his DNA recognized the bond that not even time could break. It was then that Michael decided it was time to leave. His role in this story was over. He turned and walked toward the hospital exit, with Popcorn trotting at his heels. "Michael," Caleb's voice made him stop. "Where are you going?" Turning around, Michael saw the boy running toward him, followed by his grandfather carrying Theo. "My work here is done, kid," Michael said with a smile, trying to hide the emotion in his voice. "You're home now." "But you promised," Caleb protested, his eyes filling with tears for the second time that day. "You promised you wouldn't leave like everyone else." "Mr. Michael," Charles Edward Mitchell interjected in a surprisingly humble tone, "my grandson told me everything you did for them, how you protected them, how you earned their trust." "It was nothing," Michael interrupted, uncomfortable with the turn the conversation was taking. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," the businessman shook his head. "Not everyone would have risked so much for 2 unknown children, especially someone with your background." Michael felt his face burn. Of course, the man had looked into his past. "That's why," Charles Edward Mitchell continued, "I'd like to make you an offer. PharmaCorp has a social reintegration, a program offering jobs to people looking for a second chance, and it so happens we're in need of a new security manager for our headquarters." Michael blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Caleb exclaimed, grabbing his hand. "Please, you can visit us anytime and Popcorn can stay with us and—" "Actually, Charles," Edward Mitchell interjected with a smile, "I was thinking of something more permanent. The position even includes an apartment in the company complex. Of course, if you're interested." Michael looked at Popcorn, whose tail wagged as if he understood every word. Then he glanced at Theo, who slept with a gap-toothed smile, and finally at Caleb, whose eyes shone with a hope Michael had never seen before. "You know," Michael said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion, "they say sometimes you have to lose yourself to find your way home." That afternoon, as the sun set over New York City, a new family began to form. Not a traditional family, but one built on trust, second chances, and the unconditional love that only children can give. And Popcorn, well, he could finally rest, knowing that his mission was accomplished. He had found not only help for his little charges, but also a home for all of them. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Michael, Caleb, Theo, and Popcorn has touched your hearts. For more heartwarming stories like this one that remind us of the power of redemption and unconditional love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Leave your likes and comments sharing what moved you most in this tale of new beginnings and second chances. We have a special playlist filled with equally engaging stories waiting for you. Just click the button on the left to access it. Every week, we bring new stories that remind us there is always hope, even in the darkest moments. See you in the comments.